my mom passed away a few weeks ago. And of course, it had a big effect, huge effect on my life. And I was very close to her, but that's not really what I want to talk about. What I found very interesting that I do want to talk about, or led to what I want to talk about, I should say, was the variety of condolences that, people gave. And of course, all of which were very much appreciated. Thank you. But it also brought to mind a principle that's very interesting. And this is what I wanted to talk about first, and that is that your knowledge of life and your experience of life, as well as death, is really based in your level of consciousness and your whole experience of life. Everything is based on that. And it can be very different at different levels of consciousness. In fact, it necessarily is. And this applies not only to life, but to death. And of course, death is this amazing, wonderful, maybe not so wonderful mystery, seemingly not so wonderful mystery. And what I find is that it actually is an opportunity for so much evolution. And that's why I wanted to talk about it. And so I want to start by talking about the process of dying, which of course I am not an expert on. I have not studied this. I have not, dove into the depths of all the various traditions and their, knowledge about death and theories about death. But what I am going to give you is kind of raw data, just raw data from human experience, which I believe is the basis of all these traditions. And so take it for what it's worth. It's just that raw data. So, and of course, this is an overview. We could go so much deeper into everything that I'm going to talk about. So it's just an overview, a summary. So I would say the first thing is that before I get into this, I should say this, sort of something that is kind of a baseline that you just have to keep in mind. And that is that anyone can feel grief. And that is entirely natural. So despite whatever I'm going to say, just know that when a loved one dies, there's like this hole in the tapestry of your life. And how we deal with that is up to each person. And there's so many factors that go into the intensity of that and the length of that, how we feel that. For instance, if a child dies, it would be very different than a parent. My mother was 94. She had Alzheimer's. It was merciful that she passed away. So it's very different than, if your young child dies, that's going to be a different experience. So, and in fact, there's a story, I forget which scripture this is in. I think it was the Ramayana, maybe not, maybe the Mahabharata. But in any case, Vasishta, this great mind-born sage of Brahma, who, is like eternal. His son died, got eaten by a Rakshasa. I'm not going to go into all that. In any case, that's what happened. And Vasishta had intense grief, and he jumped off a cliff, but nature wouldn't let him hurt himself. So he bounced and threw himself into a river, and the river delivered him up kindly to the shore. Just nothing he could do. But the point was he had intense grief. So that is something that can happen to anyone. And so there's no judgment. But so please keep that in mind, whatever I'm talking about here. And given that, I do think there are some pretty tried and true ways to help you heal and help the soul of the loved one in its journey. So I think there's 5 basic factors, at least to start with, that I've thought of that help determine like what your experience of death is. And the first would be psychological attachment. Okay, so, and that's to the world and everything that you've created in your lifetime. You've built this life. You have a home, you have relationships, you had a career, you had everything that you know about this life. And to the extent that you feel some attachment to that, and of course you will, then it's going to be painful to leave behind, right? And so this extent of attachment, the psychological attachment, is one of the factors. Now, I'd like to also contrast this with what happens if you are serious about your spiritual practice and you really are, a quote, spiritual person. In that case, over your lifetime, you will have had many opportunities to observe the impermanence and unreality of the world. You'll start to naturally kind of dwell a little bit more lightly in the world, you might say, as you evolve spiritually. I've heard an analogy. It's like a bird on a twig that knows that the twig could break at any time. And so they're ready to take flight if the twig breaks. So that is the analogy of what happens as a person goes through their life and is doing serious spiritual practice, evolving in consciousness. They start to see, okay, everything is changing, life changes, and you can't really hold on. You can't let your mind be totally captured through attachment to any particular thing because it is transitory. It's going to end. And so you enjoy that thing, but you're sitting more lightly with it. And so that is a partial remedy, at least for this factor of psychological attachment. So then you have emotional attachment. And of course, you have so many relationships, and it's inevitable that you feel attached to the closest people in your life, your children, your parents, your spouse, your partner. And of course, at the time of death, these are going to be painful to leave behind. And that's inevitable. And however, there is another factor here, and that is, as you progress in your spiritual practice, you become fuller in yourself. There is a kind of inner quiet fulfillment that just fills you up. And so in your relationships, for one thing, instead of being based so much on need, which most relationships start in that sense of need, and there's this ground of fulfillment. For one thing, that allows you to give more in your relationships, but it also mitigates that emotional attachment because you feel full in yourself. And of course, self-realized, then you have that infinite fullness. And to that extent that you've developed that, there's going to be more peace in your passing. And then I would say another thing about this is remorse is like maybe a subset of this emotional attachment. You could say, because it usually arises out of relationships that you have not been giving, that you have been selfish, that you've done something harmful or injurious. So that results in regret. And there's a lot of talk I've heard about, at the time of death, you can be subject to a lot of regrets. Well, if you have been developing that inner fullness and instead of selfishness, been more giving, and because usually any injury or harm to another person usually comes out of some kind of selfishness. So there'll be a lot less of that. And of course, hopefully, as you've lived with more integrity, you'll have more buckets of good karma to balance out, because everybody will have created some bad karma. It's inevitable. But you'll have created also a lot of good karma to balance that out. And as you evolve, you develop an inner strength to face whatever karma you have with courage. And then, of course, if you achieve liberation, then you're going to be liberated from the effects of all karma. So that's sort of the ultimate remedy for that. Then there is physical attachment. And this is like a very visceral aspect to these factors that determine how you experience death. And in fact, there's a name for it in India. It's called Runanabandha. Okay, it's like body memory, and it's a very real thing. You can even look it up in PubMed online, and there's articles on body memories. And when a loved one passes, you have all this body memory of your relationships with him and all that person, with all your experience. It can be very deep, and it creates a hole in the very fabric of your panchakosha, those layers of your being. So, and that can be also painful, that hole, that emptiness. And so that's another factor. And again, like here, a spiritual person, through meditation, it cleanses impressions. It purifies the chit. The chit is that storehouse of impressions. And it's both got a subtle physical value to it, and it's primarily on consciousness, but it's got a physical basis and in the panchakosha. So by purifying that, those impressions are made much lighter. And of course, new impressions are also a lot lighter. So there's this analogy of somebody who's deep ignorance. Every experience will be like carving a line on a stone. It's indelible. It just is there. That impression is there. And then as you keep evolving and you have more higher consciousness, there's more sort of flexibility in your nervous system, adaptability, so that instead of a line on rock, it's like a line on sand. So it's not as permanent. And then with more consciousness, it becomes a line on water. So it's impressions happen, but they're almost gone instantly. And then finally, a line on air. So it's a very, very fine impression that's, doesn't leave a lasting impact. So that is how spiritual practice mitigates this factor of physical attachment, or the Runanabandha aspect. So then also another aspect is faith, obviously. If somebody has no faith in the afterlife, no faith in the eternality of the spirit or divine or anything like that, then when it comes to dying, you naturally are going to, at that moment, feel a fear that absolutely everything that had to do with you or your life is going to be lost for all eternity. And I'm sure there's maybe ways to reconcile yourself with that thought, that idea, but it can also obviously lead to a sort of terror at death, which it won't be a good feeling. And whereas, through your spiritual practice, you gain this, some sense of the eternality of spirit. There's something that's going to persist after the death of this body. And with, deeper faith, obviously, you're going to have more of a sense of preparedness for that. And then the last aspect is the sort of mechanics of dying, like of the actual process of the senses, the mind, the soul detaching from the body. So, and this can be something that it's said to be very frightening. I've heard in different literature that this can be very frightening. The light of the eyes going dark, the sounds fading and dimming, all this shutting down of the mechanisms of perception and experience that you've had your whole life can be very alarming and confusing, and like, what now? And whereas if you think about it, this is what we experience every time we close our eyes to meditate. It's like the senses go within and they start to go to these finer and finer levels and merge in consciousness. So there is a detaching from the body, like consciousness is, and the senses are detaching from the body. And as you experience that daily, day in and day out, for your whole life, for many decades, hours every day, dwelling in that. And what happens? Instead of fear, it's bliss. You experience bliss in meditation. So at the time of death, that shutting down, the sort of mechanics of shutting down all the senses, you're very familiar with it. It's not something strange. It's like the final meditation of your lifetime. And the more you've progressed in your lifetime towards liberation, the more blissful that is at the point of death. So, in fact, for somebody who's liberated, it's the ultimate bliss. There's no limitation of the physical body, of the physical nervous system. So it's just pure, absolute bliss consciousness. That Maha Samadhi, that's what they call it, Maha Samadhi, okay, the final Samadhi. So as it turns out, life happens to be structured such that developing spiritually results in more happiness while you're here in this world, and a much better basis for, the next world. More happiness, more peace, and passing into the next world. So that's just like this principle of knowledge and experience is different in different states of consciousness. And what you can imagine, there's so many grades of consciousness, between abject ignorance with not a whit of spirituality, to liberation, enlightenment, and like everything in between. There's going to be so many, gradations of all of this. But so we're somewhere on that scale. Okay, so that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. But now a little more about what happens when a loved one dies then. So this is obviously something I just experienced, so it's pretty fresh for me. And I can say that I was really struck by this experience in unexpected ways. First of all, love unites, right? So if you love somebody, you feel closer to them. You feel more empathy, more intimacy with them, right? So what's amazing is when a loved one dies, through your love and connection with them, you actually can share to some degree in their journey. You're in the body, they're no longer in the body, but because of your love and connection with them, you can share in that journey. And what this can feel like is that the barrier between this world and the next becomes much more permeable, much more fluid. It's like, normally you might think of, this world as being very hard and fast and concrete, very real. And the thought of the afterlife and the different regions that you may have, heavenly regions or hell regions you may have read about or contemplated, seem like very abstract, distant, like a mirage or an idea that may or may not exist. But because when a loved one passes, it's like, and your connection with them, it's like that barrier between this world and the next becomes so permeable, and that afterlife becomes much more real. And suddenly this life, this world seems much less substantial somehow, more abstract, less consequential. It's not like of ultimate importance. The things that you worry about and concerns you have in your life, suddenly they don't seem that big a deal. The whole thing is much less consequential. And your perspective extends now into the afterlife as well. So, and this is simply by virtue of, having that connection with your loved one. Now, granted, also, you have to have some subtlety of perception. If you've never refined your senses, then you may not feel this. I don't know what everybody feels. Maybe everyone does feel it, maybe they don't, but I believe it's related. How clear this is must be related to how much you've refined your ability of perception. As it turns out, you can feel like, a loved one passing, it becomes actually a beautiful opportunity. Now, again, acknowledging the fact of grief, not belittling that, but it becomes this amazing opportunity. And there is this idea in some traditions I've read that in that journey after death, there are opportunities actually for liberation. That if you're somehow alert and prepared, and kind of the sort of map of the afterlife through that tradition, there's an opportunities that would present you along the way to actually gain liberation. Now, that's one way of looking at it. But from your side, as the person still here in the world, what happens is these kind of ultimate questions of life and death, the sort of mysteries of life and death, are no longer abstract questions. You're vividly sensing the reality behind these questions. As I say, especially because your awareness is now extending into the afterlife by following your loved one in their journey and staying connected with them. And so it's actually a time of really deeply communing with the universe and life's mysteries. And that is absolutely an opportunity for profound evolution for you. Now, the other thing is, because you're connected with them, it's going to be a great opportunity for you to help them if you have a deep spiritual practice. So with the practices that we have in this course, you can shower your loved one's soul with soma. You can guide them to ever higher and higher heavenly regions. And so that you can help them out of that state of confusion, initial confusion, and sort of, flailing about in a completely new and unfamiliar realm and experience. You can assist them. And so, and it's kind of interesting because initially, it's probably right after death is probably one of the most confusing points, and especially nowadays because it's a common practice in medicine to give people drugs to reduce pain, but even also anxiety. Like my mom didn't apparently have any physical pain that was clear. She was not indicating any physical pain, but they gave her drugs for her emotional state, for anxiety, because as you're approaching this, depending on your degree of, preparedness and faith and everything, and she had actually a very strong faith, was very pious in her life, but still, it's natural to feel in this transition, this sort of ultimate transition, anxiety and fear. So they actually medicated her for that. And so, but when the body drops off, the value of those medications is done. It's not helping. And now you have to deal with the reality of it. And that first transition point is probably one of the more difficult points, where the attachments the soul feels to this world are breaking, where the mechanics of the senses shutting down. Now you're left with what? You have to, it's like going into a dark room. Your eyes have to adjust. Now the subtle senses come into play. And so it's one of the more difficult points. And so that's a very important time to be there for your loved one with your prayers and with your meditations, and showering them with soma, lifting them up through your intention towards higher and higher states. And it's interesting that you're also very correlated, such that that's one of the most difficult times for them, but it's also likely a difficult time for you. That's in the fresh experience of your loved one passing, that's where the grief is probably going to be the most intense. So that's, again, you're kind of connected and you're correlated together. What happens, though, it seems to me, in my experience, is that after that initial phase, continually connecting and praying and showering with your intention for peace and happiness and soma and bliss, and raising them up in more glory towards higher states, towards liberation, that as that whole journey progresses for them, it also reflects back to you, so that as they come out of that confusion and fear and all of that, you come out of your grief and they're experiencing more happiness. That same happiness, that heavenly happiness, is reflecting in you. You're experiencing that happiness, and it's very healing for your grief. So, in fact, I believe, like in so many different traditions around the world, they say how important it is for so many days after death to be performing different ceremonies or prayer or meditations on behalf of the soul in their journey. And I can't think of anything that's more healing than that, because as you do that and as you follow them and feel them gaining ground in higher states, more blissful, peaceful states, then that's tremendously healing for you. If you have the feeling that they're having a difficult time and it's really hard on them, then it's also hard on you. So one of the best things you can do for both them and yourself is to do lots of spiritual practice with a focus and intention on your loved one. It's very important, I think. And the interesting thing is, like, this is how it was in my experience anyway. When they were alive, you could only do so much for them. I always encouraged my mom to meditate, but she didn't meditate that much. She did some. I taught her meditation. She would meditate once in a great while. I gave her lots of dietary advice. She'd hardly follow it ever, of course, to be expected. Anyway, but once, you can only do so much for them when they're, here on this earth. But in my experience, afterwards, they are facing the ultimate mystery of their existence, and their soul is so vulnerable. They are very eager and willing to receive those prayers and the benefit of your meditations and your intention. So you can just drench their soul in divine bliss and guide them towards liberation. And if they, can't make it to liberation, at least to a very high heavenly state where they are just, bathing in the light of the divine. Any questions about any of that?
No questions, but boy, is that ever profound. I wish I had known that a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it's such an area where I wish I had been able to teach this long time ago. But unfortunately, as you may know, I pretty much teach from my experience. I don't get information from the internet and try to, repackage it. I don't read a bunch of books and repackage it. It's from my experience. So I was not really able to teach this until after my mom passed away, Sorry about that. Because I know like Raj lost his parents recently and I couldn't really give him the same information. So I think I only hinted at it to Raj then. In any case, thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Ajayan, is there a time binding to this? In other words, as more and more time passes, does the effectiveness of this connection and helping the spirit of the soul kind of reach higher levels diminish?
Well, okay. So honestly, I do feel that connection is the strongest, right in the early days. And I think Keisha, my wife, was telling me that in the Tibetan tradition, which she is basically a Tibetan Buddhist now, she said, I think they have recommend for 49 days, you do this concentrated focus. I don't know what that time is in other traditions. I've just heard that one time factor. But in my experience, there is that kind of fading because they're going on their journey. They're doing their thing. And yeah. And the other interesting thing is, I'll tell you, it was pretty soon after my mom passed that I realized she was no longer an old lady. It's like you're behind the times if you're thinking of them as these old guys. Their soul isn't that age, So yeah, it's kind of interesting, these different little realizations that hit you as this happens. So, but anyway, the other thing was I realized they're on their journey. It's like their soul has their own path to follow. They're not just your parent or just who they were in relation to you. They have their own thing going, and they're going to do it. But you can still assist them. So I am not saying though that it's too late. I'm saying I don't know. And so yeah, I would encourage you to do what you can in your meditations and prayers for sure. Yes, Kimberly.
Yeah, I've communicated with spirits that have passed for many years through an intensive course that I've taken many years ago, and seriously, I'm meeting spirits in different places, and it really depends. It's just as there's more spirits out without bodies than there are with bodies, and so they're all on different. Just like us, they're all in different places of kind of evolution, so to speak. So yeah, it's hard to answer just when it's just hard to say this happens on this day, because it's the same with us.
Right. Yeah. So many different, it's like tracking the flight of birds, in the sky. Trying to track the flight of souls after death. You know what I mean? It's like there's no tracking it exactly, but with the loved one, especially in the, when it's fresh, there's such a strong connection and bond. You really can assist them very, very much so. So, and there's a reason that's a tradition throughout the world, because, it's based on that raw data of people having experienced that so many times throughout the centuries, countless people.
And if the soul themselves believes in a certain thing, it's probably going to happen.
Yeah. That's the other thing, all these different systems and conceptions of the afterlife. I know, I think it's probably very much linked to what the faith is of the person. Because, yeah, I don't think there's like one system that's right, that has it right, and everybody else is wrong. I don't buy that. So, yeah.
The field is very malleable.
Right, right.
Well, that was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing your experience, Ajayan.
Thank you for listening, folks. And yeah, it was really profound. And of course, I was lucky at the funeral, I gave a big talk about my mom. So that I took care of that part. That part's not for here. But this was something different, which I couldn't say at the funeral. So, all right.